Hey everybody, I'm that one guy. I made an Arcane Mage in World of Warcraft. Today we're going to do a deep dive into Arcane because I see there's a lot of new people, a lot of new mages coming over to play Arcane after all the cool videos they've seen. So I kind of just want to make an overview, right, a deep dive into that, so that if you're brand new to Mage or even brand new to WoW, that there's going to be some things you can take away from here. And I'll split it up into sections so you can kind of skip what you don't need. But I do want to point out that today is August 12th, and we're in the pre-patch event to the War Within, so it's technically still Dragonflight. The reason I share all that is because if it's no longer August 12th, or it's launch day, or we're somewhere in a different patch in the War Within, that the information I've shared here may no longer be true or accurate. So you want to use sources like Wowhead, or Icy Veins, or even the Mage Discord called Altered Time, right? I'll link those in the description below, but you're going to want to make sure to check those for accurate information, as they'll change those more frequently than I'll change this video. In addition, I'll put links to my weak auras and Porum's weak auras. Those are the ones that you'll see on my screen today. But let's jump into it. So if you're brand new to WoW, like if you just started playing, or if you're a returning player and it's been quite a few years, there may be things that have changed that you don't know about. I'm not going to go through every little thing. I'm just going to point out things that I think are important for you to know about to help you be a successful player in World of Warcraft. And the first one just kind of being your base UI, right, your user interface, and how you can edit it. It's not going to look like this if you just load up the game. I've edited it to look like this for myself. This is my preference, but you press escape to open up your options menu. It's also, if you push this nice little question mark down here, and you can see edit mode, and in here you can move around anything that you see highlighted. You can move around, right? So you can resize it, make it go horizontal or vertical, move it wherever you want on the screen so that it fits your tastes and your liking. So that's one thing I would encourage you to do, is just obviously have something that is fun for you to look at and you understand the information being presented to you. The other thing being an add-on, right? If you're brand new to WoW, or even if you've come back, because I didn't know about this add-on for a while even after I returned, it's called Weak Auras, and it's really important and really helpful, and the reason being of all the information that it can share with you on the screen that you otherwise wouldn't know. So as an example, just kind of bounce around between a few things. Up here in the top left of my screen, that's where I've put all of my buffs. Throughout the course of combat, you're going to get quite a few buffs and debuffs, etc. And there's no real great way to know about them with what WoW currently provides. There's no base UI that says, here's all this cool stuff. So you have to create it yourself. And that's what I've done here. That's what you see on my screen, is weak auras that I've created. This right here in the middle is for clear casting. It's very important for Arcane Mages. It is provided with WoW's base UI. You will get something that flashes up on your screen, but these little circles, right, these runes, that's part of the weak aura I created because it can stack up to 3 times, but you won't know that just based off of the proc that you get on your screen. You could have 1 stack or 3 stacks and you'll have no idea how many you have. And I think the more information you get, right, the easier it is to kind of make decisions on how you're going to play. In addition to that, there's these 2 little circles. This is getting a little more into the arcane stuff, but that's for nether precision. You always get nether precision when you use clear casting. But for me and for anybody else playing a game, it's a lot about visual feedback, right? You want to know that the thing you did, you successfully accomplished, or that it had an impact, right? If not, otherwise you'd play D&D and roll dice and write it all on paper. But we want to see the things we're doing, and Weak Auras allows you to do that. It gives you some visual feedback, some visual responses to either, hey, you got this buff that you need to know about, or you used this proc and now you have this as a result, and it just kind of helps enhance your gameplay. And in addition to that, you can use it in all sorts of different content and in boss fights and raids, and it can give you warnings about stuff like that. So Weak Auras is a great one. If you don't have any other add-on, I'd recommend that one. There's tons, obviously, that you can get, but Weak Auras being a super helpful tool that allows you to essentially further enhance or modify your UI. Outside of that, and again, I'll link this so you can have the same stuff that you're looking at. Outside of this, the only other one that I think would be pretty helpful to a new player or returning player is called Simulation Craft, or SimC. What that does is it produces a string of text that you can put into a website called Raid Bots, and I'll link that too. And where that's helpful is two things. Everybody playing the game wants to see that they're playing the game well, right? They want that visual feedback. They want to blow stuff up. They want to kill bosses, right? And they want to know how to gear properly or how to improve their character, because you're going to get tons of drops in gear as you play the game. You just want to know, like, well, what should I wear? And it offers a service like that, where you take, it's called Simulation Craft, or SimC, and it gives you that string of words that you plug into raid bots, and then you can pick and choose what gear to wear, and it tells you the best gear to wear for your character. Or you can just YOLO it, and who cares? The other thing I like about it, it's got a function called Quick Sim, which will show you an example of an iteration of a rotation. You can do it on one target or however many targets, and you can do it over 1 minute, or I think it even goes up to 10 minutes. And so I like kind of using it to help me answer questions like, all right, how would a robot, how would the game or a perfect player react if they had this buff or these types of circumstances or whatever was going on with their character, and just kind of seeing repeatedly how a sim or a robot, right, essentially would interact with those buffs or interact with this rotation kind of helps me figure out maybe not necessarily the most optimal way to play, but at least helps me answer questions that I have about the rotation that I'm using. So I think it's wildly helpful for that. And it'll even tell you, though, like, a cautionary tale, this isn't an exact guide, it's just one example of many different iterations, but you could start to see patterns that help you answer more questions. Outside of that, important for you if you're new, your spellbook will highlight stuff that's not on your keybinds, right? Not on your action bars. You don't have to have everything on your action bars, all the stuff that you're going to like need to press instantly and don't need to open up your spellbook for. But this is where you'd find things. You can hide passives, right? So you only see buttons that you push, and you can even things that are only have it show you things that are missing from your action bars. So those are all the things that, oh, I would need to talent all those, or not talent all those, put those on my keybinds, but I don't need all those on my keybinds. I have versions of polymorph on my keybinds already down here, I promise. But that's kind of it for if like you're brand new to WoW, just kind of having a general understanding. There's definitely more things you can learn or know, but this should at least give you a base layer to continue to jump into the game and keep going. Now we'll talk about if you're just new to being a mage. There are people who maybe are new to a mage, but they're not this new to the game, so this part of this section may not be that helpful to you because you know what mages do and you know how to play the game. But if it's still brand new to you, you just kind of have a better understanding, maybe you've only ever focused on tanking or healing or some other DPS class and have no clue what mages do, just kind of want to go through some stuff so that if you're in a group, people won't realize how brand new you are, basically. So some of the main stuff, obviously, is going to be using Arcane Intellect, right? You provide that buff to your whole party. If you get a mage in your group that doesn't use this buff, you'd be a little not happy with them. It provides intellect to the whole party. It's useful for caster DPS and healers. If people ask you for mana buns or food or how else they might say it, they're looking for you to do this, right? So obviously lets people eat and get health back in food. Way more helpful in WoW Classic, but still useful in today's WoW as well. But something you'd want to do at the start of every raid situation or every raid encounter or M+ dungeon, right? Just put that down. People will never be mad that it's there, but they may be upset with you if it's not. The other thing is at the end of a lot of your content, when you've finished raiding or you finished doing your dungeon, people will probably be looking for a portal from you to take them back to whatever the main hub at the time is. So I know when I first started playing Mage, I forgot that I could do that, and I would always hearth back to the city, and I eventually figured out why people were like, dude, what the F? And I'm like, what do you mean, what the F? What did I do wrong? They were looking for me to put a portal down so they could go back to the main city and not have to use their hearthstone. Not a huge deal, but just kind of like a quality of life thing that people get used to about mages. And then the last one being Time Warp, which is Lust. So if people are calling for Lust, they want you to push this button. Obviously a very big buff for your party, for your raid. You want to have it keybind to somewhere where you're not going to accidentally push it, but you still can push it. It would definitely be another situation where if you played with a mage and they were the only one who can provide Lust and they didn't, you'd be annoyed. So again, this is all just kind of stuff to help you make sure that you understand how to at least be a functioning member of a WoW society, which unfortunately can be a bit toxic. So I'm trying to help you know things and do things to avoid any of that toxicity as possible. In addition to that, the things to know about is just general mage stuff. Obviously, blink, shimmer, and ice flows. Shimmer is pretty great, right? It lets you continue casting while essentially blinking or going 20 yards away. Ice flows is the one that lets you keep moving while casting. I think both of them take a little practice to learn how to use well, just because, well, if you're not used to them, they can be a little hard to get used to, obviously. And then doing shimmer replaces blink. Using ice flows means you still have access to blink. Your barrier, right, is a defensive. You have it up pretty regularly, right? You can. It's a nice thing to have up. I'd hate for you to go through. Oh, good job, group. Way to get that achievement. I'd hate for you to go through your entirety as a mage and never use your barrier or your mass barrier, which provides it to everybody in your group. Just another helpful tool. If you hear people talk about alter time, man, I know that was a fun one. Alter time, you use it, and it basically snapshots where you are and your health. So, like, just to show you, if I use alter time and then I just kind of run around for a bit, it'll either expire on its own or I can trigger it and it takes you right back to where you first cast the spell. It also brings your health back. So if you can learn how to use this really well, it's a super helpful tool. Obviously it resets your charges of blink, so you get one charge of shimmer or blink back, right? So it's also helpful in that context. It's a good movement ability, but if you can utilize it for needing to go get something and quickly return to a spot, or using it defensively to snapshot your health at 100 or 90% or whatever it is, take the damage and then alter right back up, helpful. Then the two things just left to talk about just for general mage stuff if you're new is to know about shifting power. It's annoying, but it's there. It reduces the cooldowns of your abilities by 12 seconds, but it doesn't reduce its own cooldown. So that just means, like, if I use evocation here, and evocation is on cooldown, and I use shifting power, it will accelerate its cooldown and reduce it by 12 seconds. As you can see, it doesn't reduce shifting's power cooldown. It only is, was reducing based on the fact that I already cast it and it had to cast time. But that's its use, right? It could be just another interesting thing to learn. I'm thinking through all the things that were interesting or different for me to learn when I was new to Mage, and that's definitely one of them. You'll see in the guides good places to use shifting power and when you're supposed to use it, so it makes it a little easier, but it can take a bit of time. The other things is just the difference between Ice Block and Ice Cold. If you have this talented, your Ice Block just turns into a very large defensive, which you can still move using. If you don't have this talented, you'll just turn into a giant block of ice and essentially be immune to damage, but you can't move. So if you're playing and you see there's someone's asking you, why do you have that talented? Why aren't you just using Ice Block? They're referring to the choice between using this to give you a defensive that allows you to move and reduce 70% of damage versus just using the base Ice Block, which turns you into a block of ice that makes you immune to damage while it's active, which looks like it's for 10 seconds, right? So, and that can be a choice for you too. All you gotta simply do is untalent that, put it somewhere else, and you have your regular Ice Block. That's it. Okay, so that's pretty much it for if like you're new to Mage, right? You're just trying to have an understanding of how should I use or utilize my spells, or what some things are important to me to know. I guess one thing I didn't mention that you should know about is, as a mage as well, is the difference between Ring of Frost and Ice Nova. There's more skill gameplay stuff with Ring of Frost and trapping mobs, and then obviously Polymorph, right? But I think that's stuff that you'll learn and acquire as you go. So, as for the Arcane side of things, this is where I'm just going to try to go in as depth as possible with Arcane and try to think of all of the frequently asked questions that I've seen over the last couple weeks if people have come to Arcane and tried to learn how to play Arcane. I am going to start off by telling you that if you will read your talents, right, then you'll be in a much better place. because most of the information you're looking for is in the talents and then also in guides. So reading is a very helpful tool for arcane mages, just being able to understand. But sometimes as you're reading through things or trying to figure out what to do, it's maybe not as obvious as you'd like it to be. That's why I'm making this video. That's why there's Mage Discord, so you can ask those questions. So the first thing I'll talk about is the changes to Arcane. And if you're someone where you don't care about changes, you just want to know about the now, or you already know what the changes are, you can skip this part. But for some people, like myself, when people talk about like, hey, now we have blank, it's like, well, what did we have before? How is that different to me? That's not a change, that's just an introduction. So if you prefer to know changes, that's what I'm talking about. If you prefer introductions, you can skip over this part. So Arcane used to have a separate talent called Siphon Storm. It is the buff you get from using evocation that buffs your intellect like crazy and is a big part of your big burns or your big damage window. Siphon Storm is now baked into evocation, and that whole buff is only 20 seconds long. It used to be 30 seconds. So this is again just about a history bit of Arcane over just the last few seasons. Siphon Storm was its own talent. It's now in evocation. That's a big win. Radiant Spark, Nether Tempest, and Mana Gem are just gone. Again, Radiant Spark was part of your launch sequence. It was a separate ability that you'd use during your big burn and your mini burn that you had very explicit instructions about how to play around. It's out of the game. Nether Tempest was another ability that was just part of your sequences, right? It wasn't necessarily a button that was fun to push. It was just something that was a part of your damage windows. Out of the game. Mana Gem was a buff. It was an annoying buff, but it was essentially a buff. It was something that you would create Mana Gems, 3 of them, and you would use those during your damage windows because they had a 1.5 minute cooldown, so it lined up with everything else. And you'd use it during your damage windows for more damage, right? Bigger buff. The annoying thing about it was there's only 3, and you'd use them essentially every minute and 18 seconds based on cooldown reduction with shifting power. Well, that meant if the fight was longer than 4 minutes, you would run out of Mana Gems, right? Like, you'd have to conjure new Mana Gems during the fight. I'd say I had to do that, but what I mean is that I would forget to do that. There'd be times like, crap, I forgot to conjure another Mana Gem. So I'd have to do that, and it's okay, that was kind of an expected thing, but at the same time, to get to your big burn and realize, I don't have a Mana Gem ready, and you just either try to create it real quick or don't use it, it feels bad. So that's out. Those 3 things removed. You can feel however you want about them. It's at least overall seemingly a good thing. I had frustrations with Radiant Spark. Nether Tempest should have been way cooler or done something more than it did. And then Gem, like I said, was annoying and frustrating. So they did try to keep the essence of Radiant Spark in there in Magi Spark. Talk about that a little bit. Presence of Mind is basically gone. Presence of Mind lets you cast your next 2 Arcane Blasts instantly. We used to take it all the time. And when I say we used to, again, keep in mind, I'm talking about the last few seasons, but not talking about like forever. Now we don't talent into it, right? It made tracking Touch of the Magi important, so you know when to use your last 2 instants. But now you probably take it in PvP, but now we don't really take Presence of Mind or Palm, as you'll more often see it referred to. Arcane Missiles, only castable with clear casting. Used to be able to just cast it, and with clear casting it would have a bigger damage buff, right? It would shoot more missiles. You could do it while channeling, or you could move while channeling. It would, channel faster, all this stuff. Clear casting meant missiles was just buffed, whereas you could always shoot off your arcane missiles. Now it is changed to where you can only use arcane missiles if you have clear casting. So having something to track that, right, and know how many charges or stacks that you have, helpful thing. And then I have written here that it grants arcane charges. That is true if you take this talent high voltage, which sometimes you will, sometimes you won't, right? But this is where I go into reading, because if you're like, arcane missiles always grants arcane charges. If you don't have high voltage talented, it won't grant you arcane charges. And if you're wondering why your missiles aren't giving you arcane charges, you probably just need to look to see if you have high voltage talented or not. It's a read. our tier set from Season 3 and also Season 4 of Dragonflight is a talent now. It was really awesome. It looked really cool. It was a super great ability. They've nerfed it a little bit to where it's not as awesome, but it's at least still visually really cool. And what that does is it makes your arcane missiles go from just hitting one target to hitting a spread of targets and doing more damage. And it looks, like I said, really visually awesome. That was a tier set that Arcane had in Season 3 that everybody thought was so great and kept asking to be part of Arcane's just core identity, and so they made it a talent for us. Arcane Barrage benefits from Nether Precision. That is, I don't know if you can hear my son. That's awesome, right? It used to be only Arcane Blast. Now you have another ability that can benefit from Nether Precision. It's a nice little bonus in AoE. It's still not something you're going to play around as much as you do like in single target, but it's just nice that it's there. And Magi Spark, I said that's the new Radiant Spark. It's supposed to be Radiant Spark. It used to be your next 5 damaging abilities got increasingly more damage, and so you'd essentially try to only use Arcane Blast for those 5. You'd use up some of them on Arcane Surge and maybe the Barrage into Touch, but you tried to primarily only use Arcane Blast until you used all 5 essentially stacks of Radiant Spark. So that was the strictness of it. That's now gone. Magi Spark just says, hey, at any point during Touch the Magi, all 12 seconds of it, just Arcane Blast once, Arcane Barrage once, and Arcane Missiles once. And I'll tell you, you'll always blast and barrage at least once. That one you'll just come by naturally. That won't be hard for you to do. And then the missiles part, it's not like that will be hard to do. It's just whether or not you get a proc of clear casting. If you don't get clear casting, you won't do missiles. If you don't do missiles, you don't get Magi Spark. You don't get the extra explosion from it. That's all that is. And then Arcane Familiar. Arcane Familiar used to be its own button. You'd have to push Arcane Intellect and also push Arcane Familiar, which really just meant you could forget to have summoned your little Arcane Familiar. I had to make a macro and a week or to basically remind myself, like, hey man, have your Arcane Familiar. And then eventually it just becomes programmed into your brain. But now, as soon as you cast Arcane Intellect, if you are an Arcane Mage, your Arcane Familiar pops up. The other thing with that, too, is it used to be a little ball. See, I don't have mine. Voila. It used to be a little ball. Now it's a little bird, right? You're like, that's a raven, or that's a crow. Whatever, it's a bird. Okay, it has wings and it flies. It's kind of cool. Some people prefer the ball. I think it's cool it's a bird. I think it'd be cool if you could make it whatever you want, because it's a familiar, which would be something that you summon or choose its identity. That'd be kind of neat. Maybe in the future. And then a big one. Woo! No more temporal warp. All right, that was a big deal. There used to be a button down here called temporal warp, right? And that meant that when you lusted, you could also essentially lust again for yourself, which sounds awesome. You're like, wow, that sounds like a mega buff. And it was. And it meant that you had huge super buff damage windows. The problem with it is that you're not always in control of when the group wants to lust. And you can only use that ability once you've lusted, because you get a 10-minute debuff called exhaustion. Well, if you're not in control of when the group's going to lust, you don't get to then utilize this personal cooldown of yours called temporal warp. It's a 5-minute cooldown. So essentially, in a 5-minute fight, you could use this twice, but only if you lusted at the beginning. Well, again, if you're not in control of that, sorry, Mage, you don't get to use one of your own buttons. So it was really great that they took that out. It had another negative of the fact that it meant that haste did not scale well at all, because you could have too much haste, and then you could essentially overwrite your GCD, meaning you could overwrite your own spells. You could be under the global cooldown, and you could just infinitely be casting and never actually casting something, because you would always overwrite it. So the removal of that is great. What they did isn't great. There's still time anomaly. Still there. It's okay. It's kind of fun. I don't hate getting clear casting. And Arcane Surge, it gives you basically to help you with your mana. It is pretty nice, but then like you can get essentially double lust. You could, maybe it's possible, or at least just have lust again for 6 seconds. So it's kind of fun, right? To be like, aha, for 6 seconds I have lust again. That's neat, but you're not in control of that. So you could have it at the most random time, right? Because it's just during combat at any moment, literally at any moment. It could be when the boss goes immune. It could be when you're doing evocation, which uses up 3 seconds of that. You don't need less to do evocation. So not being in control is pretty similar to what the gripe was about Temporal Warp. Not in control really of that ability because it's when people lust. I'm also not in control of when I get these random procs. Getting the random clear casting, getting the random arcane surge is nice, right? Because that's just something that it's additive. You don't really notice if you do or don't get those. It's just kind of enhances your gameplay. You will notice getting Temporal Warp at the wrong time, right? You can get arcane surge at the wrong time, and that can be frustrating. But I think hitting the time warp at the wrong time is evenly more frustrating. And then they also put this next to it. That's just for the mage, gets the additional 3% intellect. It is currently, based on tuning, too far behind Time Anomaly to be worth taking. But it is an option. If you don't like the variance of gameplay, you can take Inspired Intellect, and maybe over 100 pulls they'll be close to even, because, you know, on this 2-minute fight you never got Time Warp or you got it at the wrong time. You should always at least get Time Warp. Maybe you always got it at the wrong time or something on a bad intermission or whatever, bad mechanic. But that is it for the changes of Arcane, right? Again, if you like knowing where the spec was to where it is now, that's kind of what this served. Knowing what's different about the spec and what all this stuff means, that's going to come next. So we're going to talk briefly, or maybe not so briefly, I guess, about the talents. And one thing I'll point out is that if it's a square, that means it's an active ability, meaning you'll put that on your action bar and use it. If it's a circle, it's passive, and if it's an octagon, I think that's how many sides I got, it's a choice node. So when you look at Arcane, you can see there's only one choice node, which isn't bad, right? And you'll maybe more than likely never take the other choice. TBD. The other choice is Nether Munitions. Just means after your Touch of the Magi is over, you have another 12 seconds of additional little damage. But the whole point of Arcane is trying to line up all of your damage inside essentially your Siphon Storm buff, so that 20 seconds, and Touch of the Magi is 12 seconds, so that fits inside of it. So I guess, yeah, this means Touch of the Magi and Nether Munitions is 24 seconds. Even if you do it, you'd have to do it right at the beginning of Siphon Storm, so it's not going to all fall inside the buff. Kind of counterintuitive to Arcane stuff. Not saying there's never a time for it, just saying as I'm thinking about it, I don't see it right now. Please note, this is the talent setup for pre-patch. It will most likely change. I'm almost 1,000,000% confident that it will most likely change once War Within launches and we get hero talents, because they'll play differently. But this is what we're using for pre-patch for single target, and to change it to AoE or cleave, you literally just change one talent. So, just to kind of go through them, obviously the top, Arcane Missiles. So this is going to be a longer section, just kind of essentially introducing you to all the stuff you're going to run into in the talents of Arcane and what they do. Then we got Amplification. Again, used to be more important when you could only clear cast Arcane Missiles, because it meant that you would fire 3 additional missiles when clear casting, so just incentivizing it. Now it's just kind of baking it in to, like, alright, still have the same effect, but we're going to act like that's the cool part of it. It'd be nice if they just made that baseline. Nether Precision, that's the whole thing you play around in single target after you Arcane Missiles, after you use clear casting, which you could also use from Arcane Explosion, but right now we don't. Your next 2 blasts or barrage will do more damage. So it's important to know that, right? Essentially you get into a rhythm of missiles, Nether Precision, missiles, Nether Precision in single target, and mostly in AoE too. And that next row, another charge of Orb is pretty nice. We use Arcane Orb to get charges back, right? It gives you 1 when you cast it, and then 1 for each target it hits. So you get 2, right? And if you hit more targets, get them, little birdie. If you hit more targets, you get more charges of it, obviously. So in AoE, it basically is a way to get you all the way back up to 4 charges. This would mean you have another charge. You have 2 orbs you can send. It's a quality of life thing. It's pretty helpful in AoE, and right now we don't take it even in AoE. We might in the War Within. Again, check back to guides and Wowhead and stuff. Arcane Tempo, It's a nice little buff. Basically, every time you barrage, I know it says when you use charges, but it's basically every time you barrage, or it is. You just get more haste. So that's a buff that you want to track. You should hopefully in the War Within just be barraging enough. See, there's my Arcane Tempo buff. Just be barraging enough that you keep it up, right? It just should happen throughout playing. So there shouldn't really be a time. Oh look, I got an Arcane Surge proc from Time Warp. There shouldn't really be a time where this drops. That'll maybe be something that you work towards, is paying attention to when it drops. But see, this is also kind of my point about weak auras, is I put that buff there so that it's like, it's not blocking my field of view, but I'm very aware of it, and it's going to glow when there's 5 seconds or less, because that tells me like, oh, I got to refresh Arcane Tempo. Whereas if I didn't have that there, the only place, and then there's a lust proc from Time. The only place it is up there in the top left. And I don't know about you, but while I'm fighting something, I wouldn't want to have to look up there every couple seconds to see, or even try to track it, because you can have a long list of buffs and then you get kind of lost in the mess. But also, this is what I mean about Arcane Orb. As it hits all those targets, I got 4 charges. And that was, that big green explosion was my staff that I didn't realize I keybound to Arcane Orb. Back to this. Concentrated Power, again, used to be a buff exclusive to clear casting. Now it's just a buff to missiles. Makes your missiles channel faster. There's obviously never going to be a time you don't take it, because you're going to have to take Surge. I can't imagine you not. And it means that your Arcane Explosion will essentially go twice. Lately, and maybe even going forward, we're not going to use Arcane Explosion when we have clear casting procs. We're only going to use missiles. This is a new one. This is a new little talent. We haven't had this one before. It buffs your Arcane Blast. Woo! It makes it cost less mana. Woo! Just a nice little fun little single target thing. And I like it because it's directly juxtaposed to an AoE talent. So it's really easy for single target versus AoE, right? In terms of like what talents should I switch. I like that they're right next to each other and a pretty easy choice. This just means your Arcane Barrage will be an AoE spell, right? If you don't have that talent, no matter how many charges you have, your Arcane Barrage will only hit one target. If you have that talent, then as you have more charges, your Arcane Barrage will hit multiple targets. So if you for some reason didn't have this in AoE, it would be a very not fun time for you, because you'd be like, man, I don't understand why I just can't do any damage. And it's because you'd be only hitting one target. But voila! And it's per arcane charge, so it would hit 4 additional targets for a total of 5, right? That's a fun little thing, difference between single target and AoE. This one, you'll notice you have to take to get to the next set, but this is your Arcane Familiar. Woo! Nice little buff for you, more mana, hooray, and it just gives you passive damage because it attacks while you attack. Arcane Surge reads like a damaging ability because there's damage tied to it. It's a pretty long cast and has a long cooldown. Over the course of an entire fight, it's going to do a smaller percentage of your damage because what it does is gives you a lot of spell power, right? Increases your mana regen so that you can cast like crazy, because if you don't have any way to mana regen, you're just going to run out. So it helps you with that, and it gives you, as you can see, a crap ton more spell damage, 35%. It's a big buff for 15 seconds. Remember, we're talking about cramming as much damage as we can into our Siphon Storm buff. Siphon Storm, Arcane Surge, Touch of the Magi, big boom. And then this, woo, clear casting and now stack up to 3. Can't imagine life without it. Glad it's a force talent. Going through the next one, Big Brained will be fun. I think it needs to be fixed. I think originally it wasn't providing as much intellect as people thought it would, but that just means as you get clear casting, you get stronger, right? You have 1% more intellect, so that's just a nice little passive gain. This makes your Arcane Familiar fire, it looks cool at least, fire a lot more bolts when you surge, and it has a chance to give you mana back. Presence of Mind, Palm, that's the thing that make your blasts instant, maybe useful in PvP still, useful for movement. This would be fun to take, no talents available to take it, but basically if you have 4 charges when you cast Arcane Surge, it'll do 20% more damage, which would be a bigger deal in AoE because it is essentially, it hits multiple targets, but again, not enough talents to take it. you can't imagine life without Slipstream, right? While you're casting arcane missiles, you can move. That would mean otherwise you have to stand still. Can't imagine life without it. But this is also why I say reading is helpful, because a new arcane mage is like, whoa, you can move while casting arcane missiles? Like, yeah, read your talents. Static Cloud, sounds fun, but there's more fun talents. But basically every time you arcane explosion, the next one is bigger, up to 100%, and then it resets back to 0 and on it goes. So if you ever just only arcane exploded for whatever reason, right, it would get big and then get small in terms of damage. And like, all right, maybe that's fun. Resonance just buffs your barrage. For each arcane charge you have, it does more damage. Sorry, I take that back. For each target it hits, which is somewhat related to charges, it does more damage. So in single target, it's always just going to be 10% because it's only going to ever hit the one. When you have this one, Arcane Cleave, it essentially buffs this one too, because now it will do 50% more damage because it will hit more targets. So, sorry, I said that, misspoke. It's not per charge, it's per target, but if you have Arcane Cleave, it kind of is per charge. There we go. Impetus gives your Arcane Blast will give you 1 charge. It has a chance to give you 2. And it is okay to then blast at 4 charges because you can get impetus. And that's one thing I should mention as I'm going through this is Arcane is not your classic builder spender, right? In AoE it is. In single target it's more of like a build and hold. How long can you sit at 4 charges before you have to dump your charges with barrage so that you're not running out of mana? So it's not like get to 4 and you got to cast barrage. Get to 4 and you got to cast barrage. It is okay to sit and stay at 4 for a very long time. So I know I see that question asked a lot. I'll go over it again, but it's okay to still build charges with blast even when at 4, because impetus can provide you another nice little buff. Touch of the Magi, woo, big deal. Stores all your damage and redistributes 25% at the end of it. You can read, again, reading is important, but basically it's a 25% buff to all the damage you're doing that it applies at the end and applies to nearby targets. So it's like, it's a pretty awesome ability. It applies at the end. So if it would look like this, right? Oh, sorry, I forgot I have it macroed. So there is Touch of the Magi on my target. It's splashing damage to anybody, right? You see other little dummies are taking damage. And then when it's over, it lands on and explodes, right? That's Touch of the Magi. Pretty cool. Dematerialize, when you use abilities with nether precision, so that is Arcane Blast or Arcane Barrage, it's going to apply a dot. That's a new thing. It doesn't feel on brand for Arcane, but it's there. Dots don't really feel arcane-y, but that's what it does. It applies, they'll take more damage over time. So somewhat helpful inside Touch of the Magi, right? Because as you're applying more nether precisions through Arcane Blast or Barrage, they are getting an additional 8% of that, so, and that's adding into Touch of the Magi, so it's helpful. This would be more damage for your orbs. 10% doesn't really feel like a lot. Arcane Orb is cool to send through a massive group of people, so 10% on a massive group of people because it's uncapped is cool, but again, not enough talents to take it. It's not that these abilities suck, it's just that, like, alright, we gotta prioritize some. Clear casting have a 5% chance to proc. Can't imagine life without it. It'd be nice if the proc rate was higher, then you wouldn't have to take that ability. But right now it's pretty important. Your base proc percentage is 8%, and then this makes it 13%, and then Arcane Blast has an additional 5% chance to proc clear casting. The big one, Evocation. This gives you all your mana back. People are like, why do I use it at the beginning? Well, because of the next part. You get 2%. You're like, oh, 2% every 0.4 seconds. Last 20 seconds. You're trying to figure out how many it is. It's 7 stacks. So it ends up being 14% mana. So you can see I have it down here and up there on the top left too. It's 7 stacks. So 14% additional mana. So a very big buff. And gives you all your mana back. So that's, you'll essentially expend most to all of your mana and then you use Evocation to essentially restart your rotation, get all your mana back, get a big buff, and continue into your damage windows. That's a buff for Touch of the Magi. It goes up to 25% now. When you click on this one, it makes this one say 25%. But without this talent, it's 20%. Again, can't imagine life without it, and you kind of have to take it to continue down this way. Eureka was so much cooler. It did 25%. Was what that used to say. Basically meaning your missiles hit 25% harder. Now it's only 10%. I really hope they buff that because that's cooler for missiles to do more damage. My 2 cents. Damage from a dematerialized, the thing above it, right? That dot. So as that dot ticks, it can do arcane explosions. It would be so cool if that meant it gave you arcane charges, but it reads right there, hey, that doesn't happen, because they know that's what we want, right? That would be so cool. But basically, you'll just see little explosions on them from energy reconstitution. Reverberate just means if your arcane explosion hits, you can read, 3 targets, it has a chance to give you an additional charge. So it'll only give you 1. And then if you have Reverberate, you have a chance to get 2 when you do that. Could be useful, could be not. Depends on what robots the Sims say. Not SimCity, but Sims of the characters. So that was all Gate 1 and Gate 2. Going into Gate 3, this one's pretty fun, right? As you damage people with arcane missiles, they will then take more damage. So it's just something you don't have to think about, right? They're just going to take more damage, and it feeds into the theme of missiles and the nether precision. Missiles and nether precision. This means that right after you missiles, they will be taking more damage from nether precision. This is the tier set I talked about. It's now baked into our talents, right? We're going to just get big missiles every 3 clear casting. And I'm sorry, I changed the direction I was going. I'm going to go back to going horizontally. Arcane Echo is always there. Without Nether Tempest proccing all the time, there's maybe less value in it, but it's still pretty cool. It just means that there's splash damage when you're hitting damage on your Touch of the Magi target. Prodigious Savant, maybe something we take in the War Within, but it essentially buffs the value of your mastery. Since I just talked about mastery and I hadn't done that yet, I just want to come over here and point out what your mastery does. Increases your mana regeneration, and essentially it just buffs all of your arcane damage, right? All arcane damage is buffed, but more specifically, it buffs the damage your blast and barrage receive from the charges, which is again why I go back to saying arcane is not your typical builder spender, because arcane blast does more damage when you have 4 charges, and that's your main single target ability. So you want to spend as much time at 4 charges as possible so that your blast is hitting as hard as possible. But yeah, that's what mastery does, and Prodigious Savant just essentially buffs that line of it where it increases the damage from the charges for blast and barrage. All right, time loop sounds cool, not implemented well. That's it, right? Basically, as you're missiling and applying that debilitation debuff, it has a chance to just do it again. I understand it's not implemented well. That's all I know about it. But it sounds like it would be cool. Aether Attunement, again, that's the tier set from Season 3 and 4. It used to be called like Arcane Artillery. It's now Aether Attunement. Basically, your missiles will spread every 3rd clear casting, basically. Enlightenment, just a buff based off of your mana. That's why it's important. You'll see in guides, and they talk about being over 70% mana. This is why. Arcane Bombardment adds more damage to Arcane Barrage when they're under 35%, so that's your execute value. Lay Sight sounds cool. We'll see if it ever gets taken, but it just means your Nether Precision buff, which was 20%, now is 30%. It's a pretty sizable buff to that. Concentration, never seen it taken. So, I don't know why, but I've never seen it taken, right? It just means that your next Arcane Blast would be free. It used to mean that you didn't consume your charge of clear casting. Now they've changed it to make Arcane Blast not cost mana. Never seen it taken, but maybe there will be a time for that. Last row of them, High Voltage, brand new, pretty exciting, pretty neat. I remember thinking, man, it'd be great in AoE if we had a ranged way to build charges, because in AoE you used to have to use Orb, and if you didn't have Orb, Radio for a brush, if you didn't have Orb, you'd have to run up here and Arcane Explosion, and you might not that you might, you will still have to do that, but high voltage means you'll have to do that less, because that means whenever you have clear casting, now you can send your missiles to get charges, right? And then go back to barraging. So pretty cool, pretty helpful tied in with this one, because that means as this is hitting a massive number of targets, you definitely are going to get back up to 4 charges. And remember, 4 charges is good. Arcane Harmony is the buff to barrage. As you're missiling, your next barrage will do more damage. It's pretty self-explanatory. Magi Spark, that was the thing we talked about, right? It's just a new addition to Touch the Magi. You're more than likely gonna just execute it or do that all the time. There is a chance that you may not, and it won't be your fault. It just means you didn't get a clear casting proc. So sorry. Or Barrage, really cool ability. You saw it happen. As you barrage, you could send out an orb. Again, super awesome in AoE, because that means you barrage, an orb goes out, you get all your charges back, you barrage again. So they often compare it to gambling, right? Because it's really exciting to keep doing that, and you're gambling on if you're going to get procs or not. And so if you get consecutive orb barrage procs in a row, it feels really awesome and is really cool. The last one is Lay Drinker. Could be cooler. Again, we'll see if it ever gets taken, but basically as you do Nether Precision, it means maybe your next barrage or blast will cleave, right? Do additional damage to the targets outside of it. So, that is it for the talents and the overview of talents of Arcane. I talked about it, but I'll say it again, is that Arcane in general is not your typical builder spender, right? I see that one asked a lot of people wondering, like, oh, is it okay that I keep using Arcane Blast in single target when I already have 4 charges? Absolutely. Keep it up. Just keep going. It's alright to stay at 4 charges. That means you could benefit from Impetus. Impetus will only apply. You'll only get that buff if you're already at 4 charges, right? Because it's saying, like, hey, if there ever a time when Arcane Blast would have provided you that extra charge, but you're already at maximum charges, you're already at 4, here's just 10% more damage for 10 seconds. So, an awesome thing based on how much you're going to be blasting, right? You could get that pretty frequently, and again, it's okay to stay at 4 charges for that reason. But yeah, not your typical builder spindle and single target. Yeah. In AoE, it is. You want to get to 4 charges as quickly as possible, and then barrage. Get to 4 charges as quickly as possible, and then barrage. So that's how they're different. In single target, you're playing around Nether Precision, trying to stay at 4 charges as much as possible, managing your mana, and I put that in air quotes because you should be able to not go but it's important to know that Arcane can run out of mana. I believe outside of healers, it is the only caster that can run out of mana, right? That's supposed to be part of its gameplay. You manage that by barraging, because Arcane Barrage, that's what we talk about with reading. Arcane Barrage grants you 1.5% of your maximum mana every time you use it, and it also dumps all your charges. So remember that Arcane Blast is buffed, right? Here it's just doing a 6,700 mana, right, is how much it's using. At 4 charges, it's a lot more mana, right? So you'll chew through your mana faster. Well, then to reduce how much mana it's using, you dump your charges by barraging, and now it's back down to not costing as much. So that's kind of the flow, or the general idea around Arcane, is this mana management. Again, I keep putting that in air quotes because you should just be able to do that throughout the course of your gameplay. You never want to be sitting on no mana, right? People ask, like, oh, what do I do if it's good to be at 4 charges? Is it alright if I'm at 0 and I have to cast a no charge blast? Like, if you have to, you have to, right? If you no longer have orb available and you don't have any clear casting to utilize high voltage, but you've run out of mana, right, you're gonna need to barrage so that you can actually get some mana back and then be able to afford to cast some spells, and that might just be a 0 charge blast. So if you want to think about it in context, you'd rather cast a no charge blast than cast nothing at all, right? And another thing to keep in mind that might help that be a little easier to come to terms with is all of your damage comes inside of your Touch of the Magi windows. Like, literally all of it. Most of it will come inside your first one with Lust, right? When you have your combat pot, your trinket, and you do Surge, Evocation and Surge into Touch of the Magi, that's where you're going to get a huge chunk of your damage. So it's more important to utilize that part correctly and emphasize being right or doing well during that part of your gameplay, that part of your rotation, than it is what you do outside of it and be like, oh no, I went like, it's okay. Don't be which you can't be, during your big burn, right? And don't screw that up, right? You only have those 12 seconds to do as much damage as possible. And then you have it again in a mini window. It doesn't do as much as it used to because there's no Radiant Spark. It just is like a little in your damage meters. The big one being the big burn. But you got 12 seconds to do as much damage as possible. So that's what you want to focus on. Managing your mana outside of that is alright. It's not going to be overly detrimental if you had to cast a few 0-charge Arcane Blasts. And that's probably something you'll learn to do better as you play. We touched on it briefly. Talking about stats, what has been important for Arcane is Mastery, king of all things, right? Because one, it gives you more mana, increases your mana generation, and then just helps you do a lot more damage in general. I think it's not important right now in pre-patch, but I think it will be because of they buffed the charge value for Barrage and Blast. I think they want Arcane to use Mastery as a stat. So I think it will be important. It will be the most important. I'm not sure. What I'm most looking forward to in the War Within in terms of stats is Haste being valuable. Or Haste couldn't be valuable because of Temporal Warp. Because you could have too much Haste and then essentially you'd be under the GCD, under the global cooldown. So you could overwrite your own casts, right? It happened to me once on a boss where you got extra haste and I didn't realize it, and it was obnoxious and miserable. So, and not only that, but more haste on Arcane meant you were casting more spells, meant you were going faster, right? You're running out of mana, so haste was just not a good stat for Arcane. You would avoid it. But haste is, as you may have seen written elsewhere or noticed in gameplay, haste is the only stat that you feel, right? Because you'll notice your spells are faster, right? You'll play faster. You don't really feel crit unless you see the big numbers. You don't really feel versatility except in the defensive value it adds, and the same thing with Mastery, right? But haste is the one you feel. So I'm looking forward to haste being something that I think Arcane Mage will actually value in the War Within, because Temporal Warp is gone, and casting spells, more of them and faster, is always a helpful thing. So I do think Mastery will still be valuable for us there. I hope haste is. I think it'll be up there. But Arcane in general stats always likes all of them, especially now so, right? Before it was like, we like them all, but not really haste. But you still liked them all. All stats were equal, so to speak. I think they'll definitely be more like that now, where maybe one of them will be favored and the other three are like, yeah, whatever you can get. Because obviously crit's helpful, crit chance to do big damn, right? Versatility is helpful because it adds just a baseline more damage for all your spells, and then obviously gives you the ability to mitigate more damage, just essentially a passive defensive. So again, it used to be Mastery and like crit and verse were tied. Now in pre-patch it's haste, and then depending on what sims for you, it'd be crit or verse. And haste has been important, and Mastery's at the end, right? So Mastery and haste traded places. I think in the War Within, my hope is that it's haste and Mastery. That's what I'll say. I don't know what it is. That's a guess. I'll do another video over the War Within. But I hope it's haste and Mastery, because Mastery is, for most specs, right, it's usually supposed to be tied to that class and that class fantasy. I like doing more arcane damage. I like having more mana regen. Just having my spells, my mastery of my spells mean they do more damage. But I would love to have haste, because if you played prior to now, you were so slow, and you had to be, so that you didn't go into your global cooldown. I don't think I'm going to go fully into the rotation. I have another video on that where I do kind of talk about the rotation, and I go through it, and you can watch that one. It's just called Arcane Mage Guide for 11.0. But what I will kind of talk about is some frequently asked questions that I've seen. People ask, what is clipping? And I also get to say that now, one of the changes I forgot to mention is clear casting used to be based on mana spent. Clear casting is now just that flat percentage proc chance that I told you about, with some bad luck protection built into it, so it actually is an increasing chance. But also, when you use Siphon Storm and when you use Evocation, you are guaranteed to get a clear casting proc. This is where I talk about reading too, because if you just like, wow, randomly every time I get a clear casting proc with Siphon Storm and Arcane Surge. No, not random. You'll get it every time. But so one thing people ask about is clipping. That means it's the difference between full channeling missiles and not full channeling missiles. So if you notice, as I'm casting arcane missiles, you'll see that little clock essentially spin around. It goes gray. It spins around. I don't really know how to explain that well. That's your global cooldown, and it basically prevents you from casting other spells until that's spun all the way around. So when you use missiles, the actual full channel of missiles is longer than your global cooldown, so you'll be able to cast a spell before the full channel is over, and that's what clipping is. So that would mean instead of letting the full channel go like I just did, I'm going to be trying to cast an ability as soon as I can. And as you can see, I did. It clipped the channel and then cast a spell. And look, that's energy reconstitution exploding. That's not me doing arcane explosion over there. So you're seeing some of the abilities and stuff. The difference between the two is that full channel does 8 missiles, clipping does 6, and it's really more of the fact that your priority of using nether precision in single target and priority of using barrage in AoE is such a higher priority over missiles that as soon as you have nether precision you want to use it. So that's why you clip it. If they ever buff missiles or shorten its duration or do something so that it's worth doing the full channel, you'll see us do that. I think it'd be better if they just made it the same duration as the global cooldown, because it just feels better to always be pushing a button than having to sit and wait for a little longer than you're supposed to. Double dipping, you might have seen, that's also talked about in my other guide video. That just means you are using the second stack of nether precision to cast blast and barrage, because that buff from nether precision, that second one, hangs out for just a half a second longer. And so if you queue up a barrage with it, right, here's my 2 nether precisions. The first one's just a regular blast, right, and as I'm doing blast I will queue up a barrage, and away it goes, right, so that they both go with that nether precision. That's what double dipping is. Talked about it again. People are like, 0 charges in single target, is that bad? Sure, but as long as you're not at 0 charges for very long, you're okay. As long as you're not at 0 charges during your big burn windows, that's okay. There could be a time when you're supposed to barrage during your burn windows, but ideally you're only barraging when you have missiles or orb available. So being at 0 charges in single target, it can happen, and if it happens outside of your burn windows, your Touch of the Magi windows, it's okay, right? It's gonna happen. It's better than going just always be casting. As long as you're casting something, even if it's 0 charge blast, you're gonna be fine. Outside of that, I think I see people asking, like, if I used missiles and I only got 1 charge, what do I do? Well, if you're in single target, you use nether precision. That's it. That's how it goes. That's in the guide, right? Even if it's only on 1 charge, you're going to use nether precision when it's available, and then you'll use clear casting again. And if that gets you to 4 charges, neat. Then I see people asking, like, in AoE, do I use clear casting on Arcane Explosion? No, not anymore, as long as you have high voltage talented, right? Because I want to get those charges from high voltage, because it also, 1, does priority damage, hooray, and then 2, gives me Arcane Harmony, which is a buff for barrage, which is my main AoE spender. So always use clear casting on missiles inside or in AoE, right? And then you'll be doing Arcane Explosion when you don't have orb. So if orb was on cooldown, right? If orb was on cooldown, right, and I don't have this, right, then I will go in and Arcane Explosion. Right? There you go. That's when you use Arcane Explosion. In AoE, if you don't have Arcane Orb available and you don't have Clear Casting available, and you need to get to 4 charges. As soon as either of those other statements are true, you can use those. Nether Precision. People ask about that. Do you use it? Do I care about it? To play around it in AoE? A lot of stuff is AoE questions because people want to know about M+. No, but yes, right? So it's just a nice bonus. It's just a nice buff in AoE. It's not something that you have to strictly play around like you do in single target. So it's okay. In single target, you'd rarely ever cast multiple missiles in a row because it's overriding those nether precisions. They only stack up to 2. So if you missiles and missiles, you just lost 2 nether precisions. You don't want to do that in single target. In AoE, that's okay. It's more about having 4 charges. If you're already at 4 charges, then yeah, don't missiles again. If you're already at 4 charges, don't missiles just for the point of getting nether precision. 4 charge barrage is king in AoE. Nether precision is just a nice little passive bonus to play around. Same is true of Arcane Harmony now. You don't need to play around Arcane Harmony, right? It's just a nice little passive bonus to play around. And the only reason you see me doing this right now is so you can see. I forgot to show people what that big Arcane Missiles one looked like. And you'll notice when I have it, because I have a weak aura that makes my missiles bar turn purple, this means my next one's going to be the Aether Attunement that hits all the targets. Not all the targets, I guess the ones that are most near to it, right? But this kind of looks cool. So yeah, again, you don't have to play around Nether Precision in AoE. Do you have a 4 charge barrage? Send it. Do you not have a 4 charge barrage? Build charges. That's it. You don't have to worry about the other stuff. Is it a 4 charge barrage? Send it. If it's not, build charges. Rinse, wash, repeat. That's pretty much it, right? Those are the things that I see a lot of new mages asking. This has been a very long video, again, for the purpose of if you're brand new to WoW, if you are brand new to Mage, if you want to learn more about Arcane. If I miss something, you're like, hey, I have this question that I ask all the time, and I'd love to know the answer to it. I'd love to answer you in the comments. Again, I encourage you to check out Wowhead, Icy Veins, and join the Mage Discord. I'm in there too. There's also more intelligent people than me in there, and you can ask them questions about how to play Arcane. But we'd all love to just help you out. I hope this has been helpful. I'll make another guide and video about the hero talents closer to or after launch for the War Within. But I'm looking forward to that. And again, I hope it's been helpful for you. Y'all have a good day. Bye.